with that, let me recognize Senator Cassidy.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. Childcare, obviously, is too expensive for those who need it. But I think it's important to note that it's become more expensive as we've pumped more federal dollars into it. Kind of odd. You know, I'm a doctor. It always says in healthcare, as a doctor, don't just do something, think. We could throw a lot more money at it and see what happens. Why don't we sit and think? And I will point out that we can agree that child care is important for working families, but what Republicans will disagree with, at least this Republican, is that more government and more of the kind of spending that congressional Democrats are promoting is the solution. So let's think about that. And I will note that after failing to convince Americans that their child care overhaul and the Build Back Better plan was a good idea, Democrats are promoting additional federal dollars under the guise of a crisis. A crisis. We'll talk about that. This committee does oversee, by the way, right now, the Child Care and Development Block Grant, which is the primary federal program providing child care assistance to low-income working families through a voucher program which retains parental choice. My Democratic colleagues are proposing to completely overhaul this block grant program and create a government-run child care system. And this is despite a 2022, like last year, report by the Bipartisan Policy Center that found that 57% of parents preferred informal child care over formal child care centers, even if the formal care was free and conveniently located. So a one-size-fits-all model of institutional child care with massive federal spending doesn't seem to match what parents want or what working families need. I'll also note, by the way, the irony is not lost on anyone that we are days away from the federal government theoretically defaulting on its debt, and we're discussing, among other things, an additional $600 billion to spend on a government-run institutionalized child care system. So let's think about this. Now, by the way, we spoke of a crisis. The plan comes in response to a crisis of its own making, as Democrats flooded the child care industry with $39 billion in what was supposed to be short-term COVID-19 spending. There's $18 billion that have still not been spent. The Department of Health and Human Services had to grant 9 states, 4 territories, and 82 tribes waivers going back to 2019 because they haven't been able to spend their money on time. I'd also like to point out that HHS, the Government Accountability Office, which is our official sources of information, cannot tell us how the child care funding is being used. And anecdotally, there are stories of the money not being used well. For example, I've heard that it's not been used in the direct operation of running a child care center, but on ancillary issues which are quite peripheral to actually providing child care. And I look forward to hearing from HHS and GAO about what they found. And we need this information. We could say, oh my gosh, let's spend a whole lot more money. There's a crisis. Oh, we've got to do something. It's very emotional. But we don't know how the money is. There's $18 billion out there, and we don't know how the money that has been spent. We should have this information to understand the scope and to make an informed decision about potential legislation. It kind of blows my mind that we would dramatically increase funding without knowing how the existing funding is being spent. Just think about that. $18 billion left to be spent. We're going to dramatically increase funding, and we don't know how the money that we've already put out there has been spent. Now, keep in mind that the massive unchecked spending is how this crisis was created. And now we're told that the crisis can only be solved with even more massive federal takeover policy and funding, in some cases removing parental choice. Now, if there's one thing we learned during the COVID-19 pandemic, parents want to be involved. This committee should make it easier for Americans to pick the best child care option for their family, not financially coerce them into a federal government-run institution. And by the way, we've seen this movie before. For example, student loans. As more federal assistance went towards student loans, the cost of higher education skyrocketed. And now we're to the point where we've got to forgive a lot of student loans because I could keep going, but you know what my point is. And I'll also point out that as pointed out by a man named Matthew Desmond in his book, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City, when the federal government threw additional money at housing programs, the funding was largely swallowed up by a bureaucracy in charge rather than actually meeting those with those in need on the ground. I'll point out, Mr. Desmond, I'm sure would self-identify as a liberal. He is writing about a need to further address poverty. There's nothing in here that would suggest he's a conservative. There's a lot in there to say that he's looked at how we spent money, and it grows a bureaucracy, and it doesn't meet the needs of those on the ground. Let's just not do something, let's think. Now, when we speak about making child care affordable through federal assistance, we have to make sure that we are not worsening the very problem we wish to solve or fueling an ever-exploding cost that gets transferred onto the backs of taxpayers. And by the way, it's worth repeating, there are still billions of unspent dollars to address child care through the end of next fiscal year. I'll point out this is an incredibly important issue. But there's billions to address it through the end of the next fiscal year. And we're having this hearing when there are 9 different healthcare reauthorizations waiting before this committee that will expire in September if we do not address them. To be more specific, the committee has not formally considered bipartisan text, let alone marked up any of them. If these are not addressed before August recess, that means we have less than 2 months to do 9 reauthorizations. It will not happen. And this is a basic responsibility of the committee, and the lack of progress towards accomplishing this basic responsibility is concerning. Now, child care is an incredibly important issue, but we have 9 crucial health care reauthorizations set to expire in September. Hopefully the June calendar for this committee will prioritize getting those done. Let me finish. I thank the witnesses for being here. They care deeply about affordable child care. What the American people need to know is why this is going to be different than all the other patterns like higher education and health care and other areas where increased federal spending has done little to improve quality or cost, and in many instances has done the opposite. We want affordable child care. We don't want more bureaucracy and more government spending that is wasted. With that, I yield.